intro again because I think I missed it the first time. Here we go. All right. So allow me to introduce this eighth episode of the Rain Roundtable talks with me, Adoyo, and Julia Holloway. Once again, as always, all readers of Rain are invited and welcome to join us whenever they wish. This is going to be, there will be two more of these smaller roundtables next week and the week after that, before we have the final overall roundtable discussion with everybody on October 10th. And this will be the one that is sort of a general discussion. Up to this point, we've focused on single books, but this is going to be more of a general discussion. And so before we begin our conversation, let me see if I can offer a brief summary of the books. And technology is my friend today. I insist upon it, although it doesn't seem to want to cooperate. But that's okay. Okay, so here we go. So book 7, which is the Siege of Mombasa, in contrast to book 6, which was essentially a book of love. Book 7 instead is a book of war and profound violence. The way book 7 materialized for me as a writer was very different than the way it felt when I was writing the other books, when I was transcribing the other books. So I have the sense that even for readers, this book lands quite differently. It feels quite different. And today, like I said, I have Julia Holloway with me. And let me see if I can bring our faces up on screen. There we go. Julia and I. And as I said before, all readers are always welcome to come and join us. There'll be two more of these shorter ones, and then the larger one, the longer one, will be on October 10th. And I believe I said this before we went live. So and if I'm repeating myself, everybody, please forgive me. After the end of book 9, after the end of our discussion of book 9, because each one of these weekly meetings have been dedicated to one individual book with discussion drawn from other books as well. The final one on October 10th is going to be a general roundtable that discusses the book overall. And for that one, Julia, several people have already confirmed that they're going to be coming. So I'm very happy about that. We have at least 9 people confirmed. And thankfully, this platform can accommodate, I believe it can accommodate up to 12 people. So we'll see. We'll see how that goes as things develop. So let me start then by offering a brief summary of book 7, whose first sentence begins, "War followed fast in the wake of Vasco da Gama's second armada." This is quite a transition from the end of book 6, which was Anna called the child Hera, the only name her devotion knew, a name bespeaking love. So we go from the book of love in book 6 to the book of war in book 7. And among the things that book 7 covers, besides the actual events itself, are meditations on the construction of history, right? Through a dramatic representation that contrasts the mythical history that is handed down through books, through poetry, through the celebration and invention of cultural icons, versus the lived reality, the events that are chronicled by the contemporaries of those who lived them. And hopefully this offers the reader or the listener a chance to contrast the two and interrogate the legitimacy and the reliability of the kind of received history that we accept as our own. So the summary of the book reads as follows. Book 7 is where João de Sousa is accused of heresy and bound to face the tribunal of the Holy Office of the Inquisition. João de Sousa tells Olóo his story in a shared waking dream, offering details of Vasco da Gama's second armada to Calecut, how the chronicles of Portuguese sailors in Vasco da Gama's fleet unveil facets of the age of discovery that poets and historians have shrouded in silence. A miracle in Calecut, a history of the Siege of Mombasa, a miracle in Serra Lyoa, and the salvation of Tejo of the Lioness Mountains. 1,000 years of Europa's empire crusades assail the world. And so for this conversation, I thought to synthesize my canto by canto summaries to one or two sentences, because there's so much to talk about that I don't think even my synthesis and summary would be it would either have to be exhaustively long to be meaningful, or it can be very punctual to allow room for conversation. And so I've chosen the punctual for that. So Canto 43 introduces us to an unusual fact that João de Sousa, this monk that we've admired to date, is actually being taken back to Portugal to be burned at the stake, or ostensibly to be burned at the stake for heresy. There's no account of what his heresy might entail, but we know that the person who's taking him there is Vasco da Gama. And as Julia had noted before, up to this point, the entire story of reign has skirted around the figure of Vasco da Gama, never ever contesting the myth of his heroism, never contesting that myth of the age of discovery that is very prominent, not only for Vasco da Gama, but also for a figure like Columbus, who is, I would say, would be his parallel in the Western Hemisphere. So that begins again with a sense of disorientation, because we have one who is supposedly an admirable figure, at least if not neutral, in some degree beloved figure, who's being taken back for some very daunting, I guess, I don't know if punishment is the word, but a daunting judgment, right, under the auspices of the Tribunal, the Holy Office of the Inquisition. This is also the first book where we see Olóo and João de Sousa together, right? And there begins to be, we get more insight into how dreamwalkers experience their world. Canto 44 echoes the beginning of Canto 43, in that Canto 43 began war followed fast on the wake of Vasco da Gama's armada. Here, war followed Vasco da Gama, the newly invested Almirante dos Mares de Arabia, Persia, India, e todo Oriente. So far throughout, all of the European figures of authority have always been presented with all of the flourish of their titles, right? Very elaborate, very impressive sounding titles. And Vasco da Gama, after his return to Portugal, is no exception to that. In fact, the more florid, the more impressive sounding these titles, the more the history books that I encountered enjoyed reading them and using them, sorry. And so the scribe in me was drawn into the current of simply repeating these titles, these stylings, if you will. And we get the titles not only of Vasco da Gama, but of the various monarchs and kings under whose authority he's operating. We also get a glimpse into his crew's devotion and admiration of him, admiration for his skill, for his authority, and most importantly, for the prestige endowed upon him by the king. We also then begin to get more and more of this liturgical repetition of the mandate by the Pope, that they go forth and invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue whomever they find in their way. So through Vasco da Gama's encounter with this crew, we get to hear a lot of what happens in the court of Portugal, right? That is not only in praise of his accomplishments, but also allows us to trace the program of invasion and incursion into the lives of others back several generations, right? We're able to trace it back intentionally in the shape that it takes in the person of Vasco da Gama, back at least 4 generations of monarchs of Portugal who believe that they're operating under divine mandate granted them by the Catholic Church. In fact, everything that is reported in these chapters about how the Portuguese court instrumentalized this mandate is straight out of history books, including the lecture that King Afonso gave to make sure that all of the diplomats, merchants, and clergy from all over Europe knew that the Catholic Holy Father had mandated to Portugal this destiny to conquer the world. Canto 45 then begins to question the role of poets, in spite of the silencing veil that Camões drew over the admiral's tyrannical deeds. The attentive chronicles of crewmen and clergy who sailed with Vasco da Gama to India bear witness to things that João de Sousa only heard tell once the Portuguese armada was returning home, bent on delivering him to the immolating stake. And so, for readers of the book, anytime you see cursive text, italicized text, this is text that is direct quotation. It can be a direct quotation from a book. It can be direct quotation from someone's thoughts. It can be direct quotation from what someone has said, but does not necessarily enter into the text as dialogue. So this, I believe that Canto 45 is the one that does truly pull back the veil entirely, and exposes the reader, the listener, and anybody with any sort of sensory experience of this book to some of the most grotesque acts. Something that one of the reviewers of Rain called the actions of men who choose to do evil. I especially appreciated him putting it that way, men who choose to do evil, because his phrase points to the fact that these are acts of will perpetrated by individuals and then imposed upon others, who then in turn become accessories to the fact without challenging it in any meaningful way, without attempting in any meaningful way to stay the hand or to mitigate the damage. There is mention in the Chronicles that the captain sailing with Vasco da Gama tried to raise objection against his most violent impulses, especially when he got to Calecut, when he decided to burn a ship full of pilgrims who were coming back from Meta, families who had been there to live expressions of their faith. And at that point, they did try to talk him down. And the argument that they presented was an economic one. They tried to appeal to his sense of financial, commercial advantage by saying that his attacking the ship would actually alienate the richest merchant in Calicut, whose ship this particular one was. But Vasco da Gama would not be swayed, because the ardor of his conviction as an agent of the Crown of Portugal, as an agent of the will of God, was so fundamentally rooted that he wasn't even willing to compromise it for money, right? For the potential of gain. Canto 46 then brings us back to Olóo, and there's a moment where we get to glimpse into, as Olóo is being drawn out of his dream walk with João de Sousa, who has been giving him all these details, We see the melange of dream walks that Olóo is trying to navigate that include dream walks that involve Maya, right? Maya, who's not going to be born for several generations yet, but he experiences her trauma quite directly, so much so that on a couple of episodes that we haven't actually seen ourselves yet, we don't have direct experience with Maya with them yet. We get a foreshadowing with Olóo, and we realize that he's experiencing it during his final vision. We've heard of his final vision since the beginning, the vision that he had, the dream walk that he had that ended in his death. It is this very one where, with his mother looking after him, he experiences the illness, the sickness that will read Maya experiences her first time in the Americas. And the very first time that she ends up afterwards experiencing snow. So between this book 7 and I believe it's book 8, the following one, this is one of the most important binding through threads. And then, let me just mention one more thing. The way Nyanam, Olóo's mother, is looking after him parallels exactly the way Esther is looking after Maya, right? So that Olóo sees all of that, even though he can't quite make out or understand what he's seeing, we as readers, we recognize later that the actions of both women are identical. Well, Esther is still a little girl, but they're identical with respect to their dream walkers. Canto 47, I promised brief summaries, but I get prolix. Please forgive me for that. We're back to João de Sousa in the Admiral's cabin. And we have, in this particular instant, a bit of an excursus into the beginnings of the creation of Fort Jesus, the building of Fort Jesus, and this becomes a sort of an historical marker that allows us to ask questions about the ascendancy of the English. Where did the English come from? They end up being the ones who take over the entire East African region. And yet it seems that the Portuguese had a fairly good foothold. So there's a few hints of that, particularly with respect to the first Hanoverian Queen Victoria, and her influence and the growth of her power, as well as those of her children and her other offspring, related offspring, who end up occupying a significant number of courts throughout Europe. Her most notorious one being her cousin, who was the second king of Belgium, who is the bloodiest of all terrorists that ever knew. He makes Vasco da Gama look like an amateur in comparison. He makes Vasco da Gama look sane with the kind of psychopathic and deeply violent practices for subjugation and exploitation that he undertook. Canto 48 brings us toward the end to the last leg of second last leg of Vasco da Gama's trip back home after the second armada. And it also brings us to, the moment when João de Sousa encounters Maya, who he knew as a child, but he encounters her for the first time as an adult when she comes to him while he's in chains. And along with him, she also leads all the other captives that are held by Vasco da Gama out of the ship, and they disappear into the mountains. And there, João de Sousa is baptized, for lack of a better word, baptized with a new name, Tejo, the Lioness Mountains, because of the way the names come about. I'll leave that for a conversation. Again, here the dream walk through which Maya liberates João de Sousa and these six is going to be echoed when Maya is encountering her great grandfather face to face in the final book, where from here we see it from João de Sousa's perspective. And in the final book, we see the same thing, but from Maya's perspective. So here, from João de Sousa's perspective, it's much more detailed. We get to learn of his transformation. We get a lot more of his of his journey and how he came to acquire this compass, right? This compass that seems to show up occasionally. It is meaningful to those who are humble enough to understand how it functions, and utterly useless to someone like Vasco da Gama, for whom it's just an object, right? Simply a trophy to be mounted on a wall. And finally, Canto 49 closes, I think, with something that is a combination of a summary of a millennium of history, of Europa's colonial enterprises, and also a meditation that is focused on the fact that while all this information is available in books and they may be read line by line, nevertheless, the very lines that record these events maintain an opacity to the woe and the wretchedness that they actually signify. And so Alex, who can only read the words at face value, is unable to hear the cries that are, sort of muffled between those lines, is unable to understand it because Alex does not read this poetically. Alex reads this historically, as he has been taught to do. And with that, we come to the end of the book, and I'll just read the final paragraph, which is all that Alex learns from his father's history books is the ritual acclamation for the conqueror's campaign. What he does not hear and what he does not see in the quiet empty spaces twixt the letters and the lines is the wretchedness and woe that the conqueror begets in every corner of creation, all in the name of God, in the name of glory, and if only truth be told, in the name of gold. And that is the last passage of book 7. And with that, I would like to invite you, Julia, to offer your reflections and responses to this book.
Right, it's hard to do so. I'm fascinated by Joseph Conrad, who is not English, he's Polish. His father, when he was a prisoner of the Russians, was translating Shakespeare into Polish. And Conrad shows up in England after being a seaman. And he writes the most savage indictment in The Heart of Darkness of what Belgium was doing in the Belgian Congo, and makes at the beginning of that story the analogy also to the British Empire in a way that was not possible for an English writer to do, because we can't afford to see our own criminality, but an
Yes.
outsider can. And then in Lord Jim, it's the story begins with the court martial of Jim, who is an inch, perhaps two under 6 feet, who has abandoned a pilgrim ship, which is again your pilgrim ship. And it's a pilgrim ship of Muslim pilgrims. And the sense in international law that the pilgrim, regardless of whether he's Islam or Christian, Tibetan or whatever, he is on God's journey and he is sacred. He has diplomatic immunity. And this is what Vasco da Gama destroys.
Yes.
And it's very much like what's going on right now in England with Brexit saying, oh, we can break international law. You can't, because then the whole, these laws that go back of honoring the stranger in the Greek world, in the Hebraic world. Those were for our protection.
And I dare say in African cultures all across the continent, the idea of honoring the guest
Yes,
and treating them as a brother, as
God in
kin,
disguise.
which
Yes.
is what happens in the
Mhm.
village on the mountaintop
Yes.
when
Yes.
when
When they,
these
yes.
refugees come
Brothers and
in.
Susan.
They're exactly extended that courtesy, the courtesy
Right.
of kinship, even though they are perfect strangers. Please continue.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And this is about humanity. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering, in your campus image,
Mm-hmm.
are you recalling at all? Well, it was Theodore Parker, and then it was Martin Luther King.
Mm-hmm.
The arc of the moral compass bends slowly, but it bends towards
Mm-hmm.
justice.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And we know that Theodore Parker is buried here.
I didn't know that. This, oh my goodness, you are the custodian of an incredible cultural treasure
I know,
trove.
it's such a
This is
treasure.
fantastic.
We've got Francis Trollope writing the first anti-slavery novel. We've got Richard Hildreth writing the second. We've
Uh-huh.
got Harriet Beecher Stowe. She's not buried here, but she copies
Mm-hmm.
both those novels,
Mm-hmm.
which
Mm-hmm.
immediately gets translated into Romanian and frees the Roma slaves who have
Mm-hmm.
now restored the cemetery,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
but
Mm-hmm.
who also were in the Holocaust. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm
Mm-hmm.
finding studying this cemetery is finding the moral compass.
Yes,
And your book is about the moral compass.
yes, yes,
Uh,
yes,
but I do have questions about
yes.
João de Sousa.
Please.
How true is his story?
How do you mean how true is his story?
Because there he is, a monk who ends
Mm-hmm.
up having progeny.
Mm-hmm. Ah, yes, 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 yes. Okay, so a couple of things that I need to say about this character. Remember, the first time we heard his name was, I believe, in book maybe book two. Was it book two? Yes,
Right.
it was book two when Mama Koth, was going to Mombasa for the first time. It may have been book three. I can't remember. How irresponsible of me. Um, but I think I can tell very quickly. Yes, it was in book two. So at the
Okay.
end of book two is the first time we hear the name of João de Sousa
Mhm.
as this almost mythical but sort of iconic figure of religious
Yes.
piety
Mhm.
that Mama Koth learned about as a girl, and learned about him to such depth that she knew what his favorite passages in the Bible were, right?
Yes.
So he was used by those who educated her as an example of piety and like
Right.
good
Yes.
Christian.
How true historically is he?
I'm getting to that point right now.
Right.
Okay, so this is the first time we encounter it, and then the second time we encounter him is, I believe, in book five, right? In Maya's waking dream, where uh, I think we talked about this a couple of weeks ago. The two of them are walking the deck back and forth,
Yes.
and it seems that we first start seeing him from the perspective of one of the chroniclers who's speaking in the first person, and then the narrative shifts and it becomes a third person omniscient who's watching João de Sousa and Maya, and we see Maya's mind, 5-year-old mind, melding with his without much boundary, right? Um, and so book five then brings us. I think he never shows up in any meaningful way in book six, but in book seven, he's now again a prisoner, right? So the most interesting thing about this figure, and this is what I was referring to when I said how there were moments when I was writing this book when there would, what's the best word for this? Serendipity, kismet. I don't exactly know how to describe it, but I was writing the moment when Vasco da Gama, because I'd done so much research reading the history, and I was writing this section of the book where he has burned down and sort of mutilated all these crewmen and passengers and sent the friar into the city of Calecut. So it's that the violence, the carnage in the harbor of Calecut. I was writing that based on what I'd read to that point. And in the narrative, I knew that the story would. Let me just clarify. I hadn't read about anything beyond what he did in the harbor, right? But I knew that the story was going to involve João de Sousa. How do you say? Doing miracles, right? And so I was writing the story about Vasco da Gama brutalizing these people, and then one of them asking for last rites. So in my story, I had it as a Christian asking for last rites before he was killed. And that is when Vasco da Gama thinks to call a local priest rather than his own priest to offer these last rites. And so I'd written the entire episode of João de Sousa coming out, offering last rites, and then doing it in such a way that the man does not get killed. Like, no matter what Vasco da Gama does, he cannot kill the man. And this frightens the admiral so much that he claps João de Sousa in chains and tosses him in the cabin. And I remember reading that after I'd written it. It was the following day. I'm reading it, and I thought to myself, this is one of those examples of me thinking that I can make the story do what I wanted to do. And I didn't know what to do with it. So I closed my manuscript and I went back to the history books and I started reading it. And Julia, I had goosebumps, because what the history book told me after the carnage of Calecut was that 3 non-Christians begged to be converted. And that is when Vasco da Gama sent for a priest to convert them, because he didn't know their language. And that's when I realized that the priest that was coming to convert them was in fact this figure, João de Sousa. Now, up to that point, I had no information about João de Sousa. As Rain says, the history books don't know him, the poets don't know him, Iberians don't know him. I'm sorry, my dear. Oh, you muted yourself. I get it. So Iberians don't know him. His name has vanished. Nobody knows anything about him. There's only rumors about him on the ships that he travels in. There's this story that we hear about him in Rain as a dreamwalker. And then this was the moment where the fiction of Rain, the poetry of Rain, collided with the history of Calecut and Vasco da Gama's carnage at that point. And it all fell into place. And I followed the dictates of the story as I was hearing it, so that the entire episode of the priest who blessed these figures, and who, after which the arrows could not pierce them, is all drawn out of the chronicles of the Portuguese figures. Now, as to the identity of that priest, there's no information, right? So this is where the poetry comes in to occupy that space. With respect to Vasco da Gama then condemning him or accusing him of heresy and condemning him, that's not in the history books, but the poetry called for it, because it's consistent with the character of a man who, on the one hand, is completely beholden to the authority, like the institutions of authority of his culture, which are the double pillars, the crown and the church, right? With respect to the crown, he feels entitled to perpetrate every violence, right? In the name of the crown. With respect to the church, he feels this I think very real sense of piety, right? This very real sense of piety as a good Christian, who, while perpetrating these crimes, these violences against unsuspecting peoples, he feels that because of the Pope's authority, he has the right and the obligation to do so. However, conflict occurs within such an individual psyche when he encounters a man who is clearly an agent of faith, right? A man who historically has also served the crown, but who nonetheless, by his free will, challenges Vasco da Gama's moral failing, challenges his ethical failing. And so the calculation that the admiral makes here is that he can call upon those institutions, crown and church alike, in the form of the Holy Office of the Inquisition, to deal with this character without risking undermining his own authority by risking yet another miracle. So isn't it
Right. It's very much like Paul insisting on being taken to Rome to be tried because he's a citizen and can be tried
mhm.
with executed with a sword instead of the cross.
Here's the interesting thing. Did you notice the parallel with Paul
Yes,
in
and also with
Maya's?
Peter.
Yes, exactly. I meant with Peter, sorry, but yes, Paul definitely. But with Peter, when Maya shows up to
And she
to
rescues him. Yes, it's wonderful.
exactly, and to me, it's very very interesting. Speaking about the collision of poetry and fiction, in
Mhm.
that I think I've spoken about this before. How my experience as a reader, as a student, as a human being moving through the world, absorbing and learning, all of it comes to bear, right? In the moment of formulating or creating a story, a narrative, a work of art that serves that does the work of representing and reflecting our human experience,
Right,
right?
right.
And so in many cases, the episode that I just described to you about the carnage of Calecut and then the subsequent miracle, I had no pretensions of finding accounts of a miracle in a history book. I wrote the miracle out before I
Yeah.
did that. And then I find historians who are agog and aghast that such a miracle could happen, right? And I
And
called my friends, the ladies who were in my who
yeah,
that had gathered around me, my fellow elephants. I called them and I said, "This is the weirdest thing I've ever experienced in my life." I wrote this down and then I opened a history book and it was right there. And I'd never read it before. So,
yes. Oh, that's
yeah,
wonderful. Right, right.
it's remarkable, isn't it?
And also, there he is,
Mm-hmm.
unjustly condemned, and
Mm-hmm.
he's the one who has found the Thomas Christians
Mm-hmm.
who were able to give the Vasco da Gama the route to
Mm-hmm.
India.
Mm-hmm.
And then he's treated so unjustly.
Mm-hmm.
And this is also like Maya's treatment by her mother.
Mm-hmm.
And and which is also Christ's treatment by
Mm-hmm.
the Roman Empire
Mm-hmm.
in Jerusalem with the crucifixion. And
Mm-hmm.
so those parallels are
Mm-hmm.
really strong.
Mm-hmm.
Um, in my work, I love this manuscript I found, which I think is written out by Dante,
Mm-hmm.
dictation from Brunetto, and
Mm-hmm.
he's talking about the conflicts in Florence
Mm-hmm.
between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. And in the
Mm-hmm.
end, the Ghibellines made friends with the Guelphs.
Mm-hmm.
The Guelphs made friends with the Ghibellines against
Mhm,
the tyranny of Carlo
mhm,
d'Anjou.
mhm,
And one of the episodes they describe is very similar to what you
mhm,
dictation from Brunette. Count Jordan, who is
mhm,
noble, is imprisoned by Carlo d'Anjou,
mhm,
cuts off his right hand, cuts
mhm.
off his right foot, and gouges out his right eye.
Ugh.
And Count Jordan writes
Mhm.
a poem to his lost right hand with his left hand,
Oh my. Mhm,
honoring it because it
mhm,
had loved so many noble knights.
mhm,
And when I was reading this is written by a Guelph, honouring a Ghibelline, a bit like the way the English felt about Rommel in the desert, and also his opposition to Hitler. Sense of the noble enemy who is honoured. You get that in your book, that the sense of true justice against injustice, which I think is the strength of the Christian gospel, that we are, in a sense, with the crucifixion, having to undo justice and injustices wherever they occur. The sense of humanity instead of the hierarchies, the cruelties, the lies. I don't know if I'm making sense.
No, I think I follow you. I think I appreciate I appreciate the following. I'm going to, one of the advantages of having this recorded is that I do listen to them again, and oftentimes it's because I want to reflect upon, especially the ideas that you bring. I want to reflect upon those, and my hope is that we get a chance to learn. Like I get a chance to learn from the perspective, of others, and from so many things that you've said. I found myself like trying to find that spot in the recording and going, let me listen to this one more time. And it's always with an eye to more deeply understand what it means. I find myself often going into the internet, into library archives, to see if I can learn more about something that I didn't know more about before. I remember, for example, I told you earlier that because you talked about Elizabeth Barrett Browning so much, I found myself reading her work, and I find myself reflecting upon things that Dante does in a different way, right, in a new way. And so I follow the argument, but I know that I'll be reflecting upon it some more later, to see if
something lovely happened yesterday. My co-editor, we're translating Elizabeth Barrett Browning into Italian, so the Italians know her better. They know her story, but they don't know her poetry. And we had this rather bland title, Poesie. She said, let's use O Bella Libertà. And that brings together the anti-slavery poetry, the poetry against children working in mines and factories, the poetry for the rights of women, the poetry for the rights of nations. And it's all there in this little child's song outside Castle Reedy windows, where she's actually paying homage to Robert Browning's Pippa's song. So we're just so happy that we've now got a title. The title she wrote in Italian, which is also lovely. It goes to the heart of what she was living.
Julia, do you remember how at the beginning we were hoping that there'd be more voices? Someone just asked a question. Would you like to hear the question? I think this would be a wonderful topic. It's from Simona Wright, who's a lovely, wonderful scholar with whom we've had a lot of really wonderful discussions about questions of justice, especially in the context of our current political situation, the Black Lives Matter movement. And she's one of the people that I admire most when it comes to anti-racist work, right? Like intentionally anti-racist work. This is her question. Her question. Oh no, she wrote 2 comments. I think I'll read all of her comments. Simona, just so you know, we're reading your comments. So, but how can justice come out of so much injustice and violence leveled at innocence by the church? How, as a narrator / author, can you manage to remain detached? So that I know is directed at me. Her second her second comment is Elizabeth Bear, Elizabeth Browning and her husband sojourned in Asolo, a beautiful Renaissance little town in northern Italy. And I know that you will have wonderful comments about that. And then I don't know at what point she says, don't exaggerate. I'm not sure what it is, but I think there'll be a time stamp on that, and then we can go back to that later. But then now she says she's listening. So let's see. So why don't we talk about the first two, right? I'd like to start with her talking with what she said about Elizabeth Browning and her husband sojourning in Asolo, a beautiful residence little town in northern Italy. Let's talk about that first, since you know that, and then we'll go back to the question of justice, okay?
Okay, right. Now, there's a bit of a problem with that. Is that Elizabeth didn't go to Asolo. That was Robert's territory. And it's lovely that the son actually goes back to Asolo. He deeply loved his parents. And he picks up on Pippa's song, and he sets up this wonderful silk factory to give employment to the people. And he was quite the artist, rebelling against his father, wanting him to be a proper English gentleman. It was not a happy marriage, and I feel that Robert probably murdered Elizabeth. So that's rather a shock, and so forth. On the question but she does love Robert for Paracelsus, and he does rescue her from London. She would have died if she'd stayed there. But for instance, he did not allow her to use the Cabinet of Vizier library. He told her a lie, saying women were not allowed. Well, this wonderful woman doctor who studies Sarah Parker Raymond, who is Black American, she's a member of the Cabinet of Vizier. They certainly would have allowed Elizabeth to be a reader. Robert was just trying to control her like a Victorian husband. Back to the question about the church versus I've been finding my own stance is best to be on the periphery, but at the same time to constantly speak truth to power, to write letters, give evidence which gets covered up about what goes wrong, but to try to understand those patterns of trauma. I actually met Cardinal Pell. There's a real evil right in the center of the Vatican.
This Cardinal Pell?
Cardinal Pell, yes.
Tell us who he is. I have not heard of him before.
He's Australian, and his part of the Australian diocese was a hotbed of pedophilia. It was so ghastly, the stories that came out. And I mean, I ran up against this actually also in the Church of England. And I've spoken to both churches on this. But I do feel for in Jesus's eyes, this is the one sin you absolutely do not accept. You drown the person with a stone around his neck. You do not do damage to children. And yet the structure of institutions can cover it up. And I simply cannot accept that. So I'm in absolute accord with your friend on that. But I do feel it's important also, partly within the structure, to speak to it, to speak to the gospel. And when I made my vows, the vow of obedience is not to a bishop, it's to the gospel. So I can't, I mean, they told me to be silent, and I found a way not to be silent. I don't know if that answers the question.
No, I think this is always food for reflection. I'm going to just repeat the question one more time and then offer my response to it when she asks, but how can justice come out of so much injustice and violence leveled at innocence by the church? How, as a narrator author, can you manage to remain detached? This is a fantastic question for me because the last part of it, how can I manage to remain detached, I think goes back to, first of all, interrogating whether I do in fact remain detached. Like, to what extent do I respond to what I'm writing, right? To what extent do I feel the need to redress the injustice against innocence that I witness, right? This is before I even do anything about it. Like, how am I reacting to it? Am I in fact detached? It touches a little bit upon what we discussed. I think several times we've discussed how I feel in my role as a scribe of a story that I'm listening to, right? This is slightly different than the role of author. And I think on our very, very first meeting, I abdicated the title author in favor in favor of that of scribe, not in order to avoid responsibility for what was on the page, but rather to acknowledge how I understand my function vis-a-vis the story that is being told. Because as the afterword specifies, there are quite a number of voices that enter into the formulation of this book, of the story of Rain, and I'm experiencing right now quite a number of voices that are going into the composition of Wind, the one that focuses on Esther. So with respect to my detachment, let me speak to a more immediate experience. Let me at least offer a more immediate experience to maybe demonstrate my feeling about what I'm writing. I was composing typing, I guess, scribing a passage where Esther was telling her nephews, her twin nephews, a story, right? And and mind you, for people who are listening, this is not in Rain. This is in the sequel, the subsequent book, because there are 5 books total, and Rain is the first one, and Wind is the second one. So Wind, Esther is a central character, and she's with her sister Hera, and she's looking after her twin boys. So because she's the keeper of memory, she has all these stories that she tells them throughout their lives, and they know Auntie Esther as the storyteller, right? But I remember as I was writing, I found my vision clouded, you know, and sometimes you can be in such a state that you're not aware why your vision is clouding. And I thought that maybe my glasses had fogged up. I removed my glasses and my vision was still cloudy, and I felt my sinuses sting, and I was weeping. Because the circumstances under which Esther was telling these stories to the children, like what was going on in the house, and how Hera was feeling at the time, just had me thinking, oh my God, I had no idea it could be this heavy, right? The story the auntie is telling is a very light and cheerful story because these are babies that she's telling the stories to. But the circumstances under which she's telling the story, and the reason why she's assumed this responsibility, is because of the pain that their mother is going through, right? And so the narrative is holding both at the same time. It's holding the lightness and jollity of this experience on the one hand, but it's aware of the bridge between Esther and Hera, where Esther's motive is an empathic compassion for her sister who is suffering deeply, right? And so this had me actually quite crying. Like, and I stopped
Right,
for a second. I
right.
thought, wow, I did not expect this to happen. This happened with Rain a great deal. Moments would
Yeah.
happen where I'd be surprised, I'd be shocked. And a couple of times, especially book 4, Simona, when you get to book 4, you will understand why. The one called Rosie Ran Away, that book shook me. It
Yes.
shook me. Um, and you may have heard Julia mention earlier how João de Sousa's experience in book 7 parallels my experience in book 4. I think also the compound figure of João de Sousa and the pilgrims and the citizens of Calecut and anybody who crosses Vasco da Gama's path, all of that is encapsulated in Maya's experience with her mother, right? In book
Right.
4.
Yes.
So my reaction, and I know this is a long answer, but excuse me for being so verbose about it. My emotional response to these injustices against innocents is anything but detached. I feel it, and sometimes it incapacitates me to continue the work that I'm doing as a writer.
Right.
However, I'm very cognizant of my job as the writer. You mentioned speaking truth to power. My job as a scribe is to name the crime, name the violence, give voice to the injustice, name the injustice for what it is, right? And it is in the naming of that injustice that the pain surfaces, right? That your sinuses get blocked and your vision blurs. And so as a narrator scribe, I feel that in the process of actually setting it down to
Right.
paper,
Right.
right? Because as long as these crimes go unnamed, right, they can always thrive behind the veil of silence. And the crimes against innocence that are as grotesque as the ones we see Vasco da Gama perpetrate, as grotesque as the one we see Anna perpetrate against her
Yes.
children, right? And they can be crimes as normalized and socialized, right, as the quotidian brutalities that we perpetrate against each other, right? The casual cruelties that we allow
Right.
ourselves to go against. And
Even
or
Anatole.
even exactly. And the way people respond to the naming of the crime, the j'accuse, pointing the finger and saying, you are causing harm to another, is they will either vehemently protest, or they will, regard it with sort of like dismiss it with casual disregard, because it is too much to own the complicity, like the guilt of complicity. It is too much to acknowledge that, yes, we are allowing this to continue, or we're actually feeding it and helping it thrive with our silence and our complicity. So,
Right.
having
Right.
said all that, in terms of author and narrator, author, scribe, the last part that I want to address is how can justice come out of so much injustice? This is where I think it's meaningful that Rain is a work of fiction, because I operate very much under the Aristotelian mantle that fiction is universalizing and philosophical, and most importantly, challenging. Fiction challenges us, catalyzes us to pose questions that we may not otherwise pose in a way that history or fact or journalism does not necessarily. Because while history and journalism sort of compels us, if we're going to pose questions, compels us to question outside of ourselves, to question the other, right? That perpetrator over there or that perpetrator over there.
Right.
What
Right.
fiction does is that it turns it inward.
Inwards. Yes.
Exactly. And it becomes about us sort of interrogating ourselves, examining ourselves, examining our own ethical integrity, right? Our own ethical development, and really challenging ourselves to see that we're not as good or as whole as we would like to believe ourselves to be.
Right.
And when that happens, that can be incredibly jarring and in many ways kind of traumatic. But do we have the fortitude to face that trauma and tolerate that chaos from within ourselves? This is something that I think only fiction, which in my mind at least, because Aristotle talks about poetry versus history, for me, it's fiction versus fact, right? That to me, there are parallels between poetry and fiction, history and fact, or history and journalism. So taking history and taking poetry and fiction as one and the same, as that realm of interrogation and query and philosophical self-examination, then in the process, as a scribe, as a narrator of naming the crime, right, I'm then forced as a reader to then pose the question to myself, yes, and where do you stand on this, and what will you do about it? Right? Because until I ask myself that question, I can always stand aside and just say, oh, look over there, look at those terrible things that they're doing. And so this roundtable that we do, for me, I've often said how edifying I find it, not just intellectually because of the ideas that come out of it, but because I find myself posing new questions that I might not have otherwise posed about my own ethical integrity, and questions about justice for certain, which Simona, you may have heard me talk about ad nauseum since June. Actually, earlier, remember I called you, I'm sorry, Simona, I'm talking at you as if you're here, but you know what I'm saying. When I called you in the middle, I think for you it was the middle of the night or something, it was dawn over here, you're doing something else in Italy. And Tatiana Jefferson had just been shot in her home when she was playing with her 8-year-old nephew at video games. And I felt a deep sense of kinship with her for very practical reasons. The first one being the most immediate, that she had an 8-year-old nephew. I have a nephew who is a similar age, a nephew with whom I spend time playing, a nephew who loves, just he's the light of the world, right? A nephew around whom my interest in the world revolves, right? But he and his sister, like, I find myself revolving around them just as the earth revolves around the sun. This is a transformation that was only possible the day that they were born, a transformation that I didn't know was possible until they were born, right? And so that was the first immediate anchor of kinship that I felt with Tatiana Jefferson. And then I believe that's her name. If I'm saying it wrong, then I'm gonna look it up and correct myself in just a minute. But the other immediate point of kinship I felt was that she was a teacher. She was a young teacher. There was a video of hers that I saw where she was preparing a lesson on anatomy, right? And in this particular lesson, she was describing the quadrants of the thorax, right? And describing to students, she used a friend or a relative as a model, and she pointed to each part to talk about the superior and the inferior, the lateral and the dorsal and all that sort of business. And she was very matter of fact about it, and she was very well organized and clear about it. And I thought to myself, this is exactly how young teachers are. This is how I was as a young teacher. You know, very, very clear, without any assumptions about what the students knew or didn't know, simply trying to present them the material as meaningfully as possible. And I remember being so overwhelmed by this I don't know how to describe it. It was grief, I think, for lack of a better word, but like empathic grief, because I so saw myself in her shoes. And
Right.
because up to that point, whenever I heard news of violence against Black bodies, you know, the
Right.
strangling or the poisoning or shooting or in some other form brutalization of Black bodies, the way it was always framed kept me like at a distance from it, you know,
Right.
even though I
Mm-hmm.
felt the injustice of it, you know, and I
Yeah.
felt the
But not.
outrageousness of it, but
It's
it
not.
didn't touch me as closely as when I could
Yeah.
feel myself. I mean, I was downstairs playing the piano with my nephew, and I
Mm-hmm.
remember having the sense, wow, some agent of the state could just decide to point a gun through that window and that would be the end of my life,
Mm-hmm.
you know,
Mm-hmm.
because I had seen it happen, because I had witnessed it, because it was now fact. It
Mm-hmm.
became a reality in on the possible things that could happen in my life. Anyway, I tell you all of this just to say that that was the day I called Simona, and I was like, I don't know, I can't believe that I've lived my entire life essentially feeling the joy and privilege of getting to do what I do.
Right.
And now I feel a deep sense of responsibility to to say something, to speak up. And the forum that I had for that was RAIN, right?
Yes.
RAIN, which does the work of naming that kind of violence
Right.
without compunction. And my
Good.
question to
Yes.
her was a very practical one. I was like, so how do I get this thing published? Right? And she had some ideas. She offered me some ideas. And I was really grateful for that. But more importantly, she listened to me
Yes.
talk about this distress and this grief. And her response, I will never forget, was, this is it's such a tragedy, it's such a shame
Yes.
that you should have to feel like you have to leave a testimony of your life because of the way the world is. That
Right.
this thing happens and you are basically pushed into that corner where it ends up sort of creating this mold where I don't feel like my life has any meaning until I've done something to, if not
Yes.
redress, at least address
Yes.
the
Yes.
shape of
So,
injustice.
this is the way I feel about Dante's Commedia. It
Mhm,
is his own therapy in order to
mhm,
be ours, to
mhm,
teach us justice.
mhm, mhm,
And I hope you read the essay because it's on
mhm.
that.
Yes, I will. I will.
Yeah, and um, the book I have come to love more and more is Apuleius's Golden
Mhm,
Ass. Here
mhm,
he is, African, participating in the Roman Empire and its culture, but also like Conrad, seeing through it.
mhm, mhm,
He describes what it is like to be a slave because he's become, well, his autobiographical character,
mhm,
Lucius, has
mhm,
become the donkey. And so
mhm,
he sees everything from the perspective of the donkey who is
mhm,
rather unjustly treated.
mhm,
And the donkey is there when the robbers have captured a young woman and her soon to be husband.
mhm,
And they're in the cave, and the old woman has prepared the meal. And
mhm,
then she tells, and it's the very center of the book,
mhm,
the most beautiful story of Cupid and Psyche.
mhm,
And it's absolutely lovely. Venus is jealous of Psyche,
mhm,
but
mhm,
Psyche is able to undo, to carry out all of the tasks Venus sets her,
mhm,
and finally win Cupid to be her
mhm,
husband.
mhm.
And their child is born and is called Joy.
Mm.
Then the old woman hangs herself,
Mm.
and the robbers eat the food she has
Mm.
prepared for them,
Mm.
and they kill the two young lovers.
Mm.
So here you have this
Mm.
absolutely beautiful story
Mhm.
encapsulated in sheer horror and injustice and
Mhm.
cruelty,
Mhm.
crudelta, and so
Mhm.
forth. And there are times when I sort of feel my situation here with the Roma. we sort of created something which feels like the kingdom of God. It feels wonderful, not having hierarchies and creating a garden together. But then I have to deal with the outside world, which can be extremely cruel. Doesn't pay them, and they're suffering. The family in Romania, they can't afford to get electricity in their houses, and burning candles could mean houses burning down, the children dying, and so forth. And so we're sort of living in that sort of story with joy, and then around it is the cruelty. And I'm realizing that that's probably reality.
Yeah, yeah.
That it is important to create
This
this.
is this is exactly what I was thinking when you finished telling the story about Cupid and Psyche bearing this child called Joy. And
Yeah.
yet, even after having heard the story, right?
Yes.
Going back into the frame story, as it were,
Yes.
even the listeners of that potentially beautiful outcome still choose nonetheless to perpetrate this evil
Right. Right.
that prevents that joy from ever reifying. And yet, Julia, here's what's incredible about it: that the story was even told is itself
Yes.
a creation of something beautiful,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
That the story was even told is like the seed of possibility. If not for these particular perpetrators of evil, for other potential who might contemplate such a thing. It's I'm so glad you brought this up, but lately I've been thinking so much about how easy it is to slide into the cynicism and the bitterness of that you see of the world that we live in, the cynicism and bitterness wrought of people's actions for sure, but also of events, right? Events that are seemingly beyond
Right.
any
Like
individual control.
losing our wonderful Supreme Court just.
Yes, exactly
Yeah.
that.
Right.
And something that struck me, because when I heard news of that, I have been this past summer consciously, like consciously cultivating love, right?
Right.
Purposely cultivating love, and I don't mean the sentimental, rosy, dovey feeling, but
Right.
rather the idea of love that we find in Dante, that idea that love is
Yeah.
about nurturing the most vital and best of ourselves, even when that means taking bitter medicine to do it, right? Love means assuming just like accepting humility, right?
Yes.
Assuming a
Yes.
role of humility, um, where you may not be seen, you may not be heard, you may not be acknowledged, no one may even know of your existence, or anything that you do, or even when you do it in plain sight, nobody acknowledges it. But
Yes.
assuming that humility as an intrinsic part of of nature, right? Taking
Yes.
it for granted that it is perfectly natural not to be praised for doing something that is good for
Right.
you or for other people, right?
Yes.
Because in the very transactional society we live in, kids are conditioned, not just kids, but people are conditioned to think that when you do something good, you should get a pat on the back, right? Or you should get some kind of a reward, some kind of acknowledgement, accolades, prizes, money, esteem. That some people should somehow show that they see, that they recognize you've done something good. This, I say, is extremely transactional, extremely utilitarian. And I think it goes against the notion of like the gift of grace that I think is at the core of love. And the gift of grace, I think I brought this up a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about faith. The gift of grace is without cost and without price. So one who offers a gift to another should be perfectly able to offer it and separate without expecting or even receiving thanks in return. Right? Mm-hmm. And to cultivate that is incredibly difficult when we are socially conditioned to stop and wait and hear the thank you. It's like, well, aren't you going to say thank you? You know, things like that, you know?
Yes. Actually, I've been thinking about this a lot because I'm sort of in a situation. What I found lovely about living with the Roma is that it's a very sort of natural reciprocity. If you are kind, they are kind. And this is in their stories. And kindness is not money. It can just be a smile. It can be the love between, the acceptance and so forth. Now, the word kind in English really means natural. And it's natural for a mother when the baby is born, the hormones and so forth. She is in love with the child. And the child and his brain forms to learn empathy from her smile mirrored in his. And now the two smiles turn into laughter. They turn into joy. And it's that joy which I think allows the child's soul to grow. But if the child is not allowed that, Roma children are given that. My Roma won't even allow me to give illustrated Dantes to children. They say cruelty children should not be subjected to, even in images. But what do we do in the televisions that we have the children sit in front of? They're all about violence and cruelty. We're training a warrior race the way the Spartans did. We're not teaching kindness.
Yes.
Which is,
And
I see it with mother birds feeding and father birds, babies. It's the most natural instinct to nurture.
And in addition to kindness as a natural, there's also the kindness is intrinsically humble, right? Kindness is intrinsically humility because it's Simona said in response to the TV sets, she says, get rid of TV sets. And I agree 100%. But Simona also says here that she was just trying to explain the concept of love to her students who are encountering Boccaccio's Decameron for the first time, right? And she explained it. I'm going to quote what she says. I explained it as the engine that creates, not out of necessity or need. It is self-generating and generative. And I think that is such a beautiful encapsulation of what love is. Love is self-generating and generative and transformative. I've had this discussion with a friend of mine who is just deeply, deeply engaged in discovering love, for lack of a better phrase. And he in our discussions, one of the things that we come back to time and again is that very simple adage, charity begins at home. Now I introduced to him 1 Corinthians chapter 13, right, which describes caritas, right, describes love. And the reason why I introduced this to him, it's the passage that is used a lot in weddings and a lot of these kinds of like romantic situations where they talk about how love is kind, love is giving, love is generous, love is not jealous, and love is forgiving, etc. In the English translation, the word love, which is so polysemic, right, across so many contexts, it doesn't translate very well. And so what I did with my friend is I offered him a reading of the of the passage in the, I think, a New English Version translation, but I also gave him the Vulgate Latin translation, and I made a recording of it for him so that he might appreciate the impact of the word caritas, right? Caritas, caritas, as the love that is being spoken of, that unconditional love that we all refer to so much. And the reason why I wanted him to get this impression of caritas is because, coming back to the concept of charity begins at home, what we were talking about was about how so often in popular narrative, in books, in television, in film, in just ordinary life, when people talk about love, it's always about receiving love, being the object of love, right? Somehow it being a thing that you get from outside, like a cloak that you then put on and can say, look, I am beloved, or some kind of commodity that you can acquire, that you can win. But the where our discussion was going was that there is no love, there can be no love for any one individual, but for the love that is generated in their own heart, whether it is filial and parental love or romantic love, right? So a romantic couple together, if one partner is hungry for love, is bereft of it, it won't matter what the other partner does or says to offer love if that first partner does not have love in their heart. Right? It is resonant. It is, yes, it is a romantic vulgarization. This is true. Like the love between a couple, for example, the intimate love between a couple, I think it is experienced at its fullest when it is resonant of the love within each one, not whatever they're receiving from the outside. And these were such wonderful conversations, because at the end of it, the understanding that I came away with, or the clarification that I came away with, was that, again, going back to banning TV sets and movies, like, I think popular culture does such a disservice to young people when it suggests to them that love is something that you're supposed to get from outside, right?
What I love is seeing elderly couples who love each other. And they're like children playing with each other. They read each other's minds. There's this, and I'm also warmed by that. And I wish I had it. I don't. But I've also loved watching the Roma couples, because they marry too young. They marry in their teens, sometimes 15, and so forth. Have babies too young. But they're still, as adults, capable of playing with each other like children, which we don't allow in our marriages.
Yes.
There needs to be that returning to a playfulness. Love doesn't have to be serious, it can be joyful.
The easy reciprocity of being able to accept and forgive one another, just like the simple slights that are part of interacting, you know? Yeah. You know, on that note, a while back when I was in college, I had a deep aversion to Valentine's Day, a profound aversion to Valentine's Day. And finally, my roommate asked me, she goes, "Why do you hate Valentine's Day so much?" And I told her, it's not that I hate Valentine's Day. It's that the way it is advertised and sort of imprinted on people's minds is that this is the day when you express love. And I think, well, why this one day? Why can you not express love every day? And why is it that you express love with things, right? With chocolates and flowers, right? Like with chocolates and flowers. Why? How is it? Why can't exactly? Why can't expressing love be that everyday thing where the person with you understands or like intuits, the person with you is comfortable intuiting that you have like you're mutually ethically I don't know, bonded, for lack of a better word, right? That your well-being is one and the same, right? That decisions that you may make as an individual necessarily take into account the well-being, and not just of this other person, but of everyone around you. Because think about how terrible it is when, if you're with a partner, they're only ever kind and generous to you, but they're indifferent or cruel to everybody else around. That to me I have never enjoyed that. And the thing that I enjoy the most is, even when I'm not around, observing or seeing evidence of my partner's grandness of heart, my partner's generosity, my partner's kindness, that has nothing to do with my presence or my being there as an audience or as a recipient of that kindness, right? Because then it's not about it being transactional or utilitarian in some way. You realize that this is a person who is nurturing the world soul, who's contributing to a more holistic and a more healthily robust, I guess, spirit of love in the air. I'm not sure how we got onto the subject of love, but it's always
it certainly is Dante's
yes, it's certainly, and then it's also a
and what I
continuation.
love is in the final cantos, there's so many references to mother birds with babies or mothers with babies. Getting right at kindness. Beatrice is kind to Dante, but she can also tease him a bit. They can be playful,
and she can also be stern and just like, hey, stop that, you know? So I love that she has this entire range, and he also accepts this entire range of interaction with her, where she will say, no, I will not have that, to please, you know, come forward, welcome, come home, you know? And like you said, also the playfulness and the teasing and the sort of the side eye, you know, especially the side eye that she gives him in Canto 17 when he's with Cachaguida and he's feeling all proud of his ancestry. And she's like, yep, I don't think so.
And nobody catches that. I mean, when we read that canto.
He's so blatant about it. He's like, she looked at me like, no, I don't think so.
And I love the way Dante makes these sort of hooked atoms to other parts of the Commedia, where that goes right back to the reading of Lancelot and Guinevere. It's an amazing text.
Yes. So I want to know from you, Julia, with respect to book 7, right? This is where
the robbers are eating the banquet that the hanged old lady has prepared.
Yes. I think it's an apt analogy. I think it's a very apt analogy, especially since we know that carrying your analogy forward, Vasco da Gama, while he was still the captain major, had ample experience of the possibility of fraternity between strangers when he witnessed João de Sousa bond with the Thomas Christians in Mombasa, right? When he witnessed, born out of this kinship, this very practical consequence consequence where now they were able to get someone to show them the way to India, right? Because of this kinship.
And in this case, there should be reciprocity, but it's
Exactly. And yet, what's really interesting is Vasco da Gama now, after he's been endowed with all these riches and privileges, thanks to what João de Sousa made
yes.
possible during the first trip, there's this passage that says, uh, setting out on his second expedition around the Cape of Good Hope, Vasco da Gama had, with nostalgic pride, imagined the tribute that he would pay once he arrived in Calecut at the grave of the fallen João de Sousa, whom he had been forced to abandon. He would find the tomb of the young man of faith, and there erect the padrão, the little stone monuments that the Portuguese put everywhere they went, that the king had commissioned to lay claim to India. This would serve to tell the world of the debt of the crown of Portugal to the miracles of the monk. He could not have imagined bringing back the miracle worker to face the purifying flames of the auto da fe for transgressions against holy doctrine. So this idea that Vasco da Gama has in his head, as materialistic as he is, this idea that he has of somehow being able to let me just respond to
Clean the
Simona,
slate.
who's leaving us now. There we go. Thank you, Simona, for accompanying us all this way. This idea that Vasco da Gama has, that the way to honor this young monk that he had abandoned to the fever and possible death, because he does assume that João de Sousa is dead, by erecting upon his grave this declaration, this completely arbitrary claim, right, that Portugal is making, this claim of power, strikes me as, I think, something very, very characteristic of the age of discovery, where these European companies went around just basically planting their stakes wherever they went and claiming it for themselves. Interestingly, it's not that different from the moonlanders appearing on the moon and planting their flag on there. I don't think the impulse is very different from the colonizer's impulse. It's just the moon has the, at least from our perspective, from our ability to perceive, the moon is uninhabited, and therefore the inhabitants of that land were not subjected to the kind of cruelties that the colonizer would subject them to. And every time I encounter any sort of science fiction story about human beings going out into the world, they repeat the drama again of the colonizing fantasy, where the human beings show up and they take over and they claim and they wreak all kinds of havoc, and it makes no sense to me whatsoever, you know. But the thing that I wanted to ask you about has more to do with outside of the violence that he enacts, has more to do with the scene in Sierra Leone, where the 63 refugees, right? The 63 refugees, I think, is the best word for it, find end up essentially reifying those biblical phrases that are in the psalm about walking through the valley of the shadow of death, because that the way the psalm described it. I'm sorry.
Where I fear no evil.
Yes, fear no evil. Exactly. The way the narrative of the psalm goes seemed to go in lockstep with the experience of these refugees as they moved through, right? First having to escape with their lives and then enter the mangrove forest, knowing that the valley of the shadow of death that they were escaping wasn't the landscape itself, but the grip or the grasp of the Portuguese, right? And here we see again the compass acting the way it acted when it was with Maya, acting the way it acted when Vasco da Gama was first presented with it, where it continues to point at the chest of the person who's holding it, right? Um, and you had asked me earlier about if I had in mind the quotation about the moral arc of
The arc of the moral
of the moral
compass.
compass, right? The arc of the moral compass. Interestingly, what I was thinking, at least what I had present in my mind while I was writing, had more to do with, I think, an idea that I first found myself articulating back in 2004 when I was giving a speech to incoming graduate students into my program. And when you give a speech to an incoming class, it's often, welcome. Hopefully, it's a welcome to paradise. You're going to have a great time. This is going to be, sort of a transformative part of your life. And I hope you have, I hope you're ready to you're up to the challenges that it presents. The issue for me, however, was that um, the 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 experience that I had up to that point of 3 years in that graduate program had been extremely traumatic. Like it had been, and trauma that was rooted not just in my personal experience, but in the circumstances overall. Because I started grad school, my first day of class was September 12th, 2001, which was the day immediately following the destruction of the Twin Towers and the bombing of the Pentagon. And so it was a day when the world turned upside down. And so it took me years to reorient myself, because on that day, that first day of school, I had entered a graduate program and I was sure this was going to be the beginning of the rest of my life. And suddenly, none of it made any sense, right? Literature made no sense. Grammar, rhetoric, none of those made any sense in a world that in and of itself didn't make any sense. Anyway, so this, I think, contributed largely to that sense of trauma. So 3 years hence, I'm asked to invite the new graduate students in. And I couldn't think of a way to do it in a conscientiously responsible way, except to suggest to them. I used as a metaphor for the entire presentation the fact that the campus, the university campus where I went to school, did not have any signposts.
Did not have any
Signposts.
right.
Oftentimes on a university campus, there will be signposts pointing you which way to the library and which way to the mess hall and with this way to that dorm and to that building. This campus didn't have any of that. You would be lucky to find the name of a building, maybe on a plaque on the wall, but you didn't have any of these sort of billboard type notifications of where you were. And so the crux of my speech told them that when someone first comes here, it's very easy to distinguish who's a newcomer because they're always asking for directions, right? They're always trying to find, they're so used to looking at the map that says, okay, here's Widener Library. And now they start looking for the signs pointing them to Widener Library. But in a place where there are no such signs, you really have to just keep your eyes open and be alert. And if you're brave enough, ask someone, where is Widener Library? And they will tell you. And so because
that sounds like England during the Second World War, with all the street signs, everything was taken down.
Everything was taken
so that
down.
if the Germans invaded, they wouldn't know their
They
way
wouldn't
around.
know. Well, I don't know why this university does it this way, but this is how they have it, right? And honestly, I don't mind that at all. I actually rather liked that, right? I rather liked not myself, not only sort of getting used to this. And I made a joke about how some buildings shared the same name as a street that was on the other side of town, right? So the street was on one side of the town, but the building was on a completely different street on the other side of town, or the other side of campus, sorry. So you couldn't say go on Quincy Street and expect to find Quincy House there because it was in a different place, right? So all of that was very funny, but the conclusion of the speech was that, at the end of the day, don't be shy about asking people for directions, right? Whatever it is that you're working on, engage other people in it.
Yes.
Second thing being, accept the challenge of developing that compass that will point the way to the world as it could be,
Yes.
and not just the world as it is. So that was the beginning of that idea of a compass that really
Lovely.
responded to
Yes.
your need. And in this particular case, Maya, when she first starts out, and this compass won't stop pointing at her, she still doesn't understand that it is telling her that if she wants to orient herself, she has to look within, right?
Right.
She has
Very
to
good.
interrogate within, and she has to ask, she has to challenge herself. When Vasco da Gama receives his compass, and he receives it as a sort of a
An
symbol of
object.
vassalage, right? As
Yes.
a symbol of surrender. And he dismisses it as a useless object, even if a valuable sort of trophy, because it's still pointing at him. And what's the question that he is posing? And what Rain proposes, the question that Rain proposes he is posing, is the one that Rain proposes all of the people of the Age of Discovery are posing, which is essentially um, uh, ways to the way to the kingdom of heaven, right?
Yes.
How to self actualize in the fullest way. They're completely misdirected in thinking that it is through conquest and acquisition
Right.
and exploitation and material wealth and imposing control over other people. When if they really truly believe and they think it is true, which is what Rain is proposing is true, if their ultimate goal is to actualize the kingdom of heaven on earth, because they're declaring it left and right that that's what they're out to do, right? If that is truly their goal, then they should look within and
Yes.
pose those questions from within and interrogate within, and be willing to challenge themselves to be humble, be willing to challenge themselves to extend
Yes.
love rather than violence or war, right? Be willing to extend the hand of friendship and brotherhood, right, to others, because it is mentioned in a passing note, and I found this in historical documents, that one of the things that the Pope asked the Portuguese to do was to rebuild the bridge between the St. Thomas Christians and the Holy See.
Ah, right.
But it is mentioned at it's such a passing breath that
Right.
it doesn't make much of an impression, because what makes an impression is his subsequent three, no, actually four paragraphs of that entire encyclical or that entire bull that tells them to go forth and conquer, right, and subdue and vanquish.
Essentially they destroyed the Thomas Christians.
Oh, voilà.
They destroyed their library.
Mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm,
these were the oldest
mm-hmm,
Christians.
mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. Thankfully, the Thomas Christians are still in India today. But do you know how robust they are? Compared to before?
In Kerala, see.
Yes. Do you know very much about them in Kerala today?
No, mainly what I know was from this bishop who was in Egypt, who was
Mm-hmm,
working with one of the Thomas Christians, who was writing his thesis on the history
mm-hmm,
of, and oh, the history it's just so tragic because the Jesuits come in and they absolutely cannot accept
mm-hmm,
this older version of Christianity.
mm-hmm,
So they
mm-hmm.
do everything to destroy it. And
Jeez. Ugh.
um,
I find myself always sort of veering into other things, but I want to come back to the the topic that I wanted to talk to you about this miracle on the mountain, right? The
miracle on the
on the mountain,
yes.
on the mountain when they first arrive, and as I was saying earlier, um, I think this will tickle you in particular, Julia, because this is I believe it's Canto 48. Yeah, this is maybe this is perhaps one of, I think, possibly three direct quotes from Dante. Um, I won't present it as a as a hey, name that passage kind of challenge, although I'm tempted to, but I think you'll recognize it right away. Okay. So this is the place where they've arrived at the village. All the refugees have arrived at the village. The villagers have sent their young men out to camouflage their path so the Portuguese don't find them. And then I'm sorry. And then the older women and the girls feed them and nurse them back to health, right? And then on the third day, after they've been fed and their wounds have been washed, then the village gathers around to hear their story, right? And so I would like to read that passage, right? And like I said, I think you'll recognize the echo of Dante's voice here. It changes the context. I'll give you that much. It changes the context, but it's the same voice of the poet standing over my shoulder saying. So here we go. When night fell on the third day, can you hear me well enough? Okay, good. When night fell on the third day, all the village gathered around in the moonlight to hear 63 stories of whence the company had come. One by one, by one, by one, each man and woman and child from the sea recounted their lives in drawing, in dance, and painting, and song. And even though they did not speak the language of the villagers, all were understood. Each one spoke and was heard, and then received a name rooted in the place and story of their birth.
Is it where they arrive in hell and they're like the leaves one by one?
And then later, when they stand in front of Minos,
Yes.
and they tell their story, and Dante said each spoke and was heard, and then was sent down. And I remember this came out natural like this, and I was taken aback. I thought, whoa, but the context is so different. Like they're not entering.
I have a friend from the European University. She's retired now. And she did a wonderful project where she worked with the immigrants, having them do the drawings of their stories of how they made it to Italy and so forth, which is what you're describing here.
Right, exactly. And then from the story that they tell, then the villagers then give them a name, and in a sense, it's like a baptism where where the baptismal practice is itself a way of bringing someone into a community. This is the case in the Christian tradition. And I think if we make that direct tie with Dante, I think one of the best ways that he describes the function of baptism, right, as the what's the word I'm looking for? The initiation into a community, right? The purposeful welcoming into a community of faith, right? Because he's working on the logic of being a member of the community of faith is what is desirable, and when there are transgressions that can cause you to be ejected from that community through excommunication, right? Anyway, I remember Canto 4 of Inferno, right, includes, among other spirits, babies who are not baptized. And for a very, very long time, I couldn't quite understand the rationale of that. And I went along with many of those voices that suggested that it was a sort of gratuitous cruelty on Dante's part. This is irrespective of whether he was reflecting, sort of a precedent within the culture, right? The culture of what Inferno was supposed to be about. Anyway, there was a few years ago, I believe it was in 2008. So it wasn't that long ago. The Catholic Church, the Pope, declared the absolution of all the babies souls in limbo, so that all of the unbaptized babies now could go to heaven, because the Pope in Rome, and I'm talking about a historical document, the Pope in Rome had absolved them, and so now they could be saved. And I was caught between crying and laughing and being
Yes.
utterly just distraught with, like, there's no hope for this world if people don't understand the poetic significance of the presence of those baby souls in limbo. And my own understanding of it only came after I'd gotten past, I think, the middle of Purgatorio, right? I believe it's in maybe Purgatorio 18. I'm not sure. But it's the arc that is covered by 16, 17, and 18 of Purgatorio, when he's talking about the responsibility that the state has to the citizen, right? The responsibility that the church has to the spiritual life of the citizen, the responsibility that the state has to the education of the citizen, right? And then in turn, the responsibility that a community of faith has to the young souls that have still to develop their own independence of will, as it were. Like, their intellect is not sufficiently informed or sufficiently developed to inform their will. So it was at that point, I guess, in my second year of co-teaching or being a teaching fellow for the Dante course, it was only in that second year that I began to understand the function of baptism as a ceremony, not just that formally sort of names somebody, or gives them basically the membership card to the community of faith, but rather a formal representation of how the elders, the guardians, the wards of the young assume responsibility for the holistic well-being of the new soul, from physical to intellectual to spiritual, right? And essentially hold them, right, by proxy, until they can take the reins for themselves. And this is what I understood baptism to be, so that adults who fail to baptize their child, right, in this spirit, or delay it too much, right, are essentially leaving the souls of the children bereft of this kind of warding protection, right? And essentially leave them out in the wild. And if that child perishes before that kind of communal initiation can happen, then they're relegated to this no place, this place of hopelessness that is limbo. And so to have the church, the historical church today, declare that null and void, right? Because people are outraged that babies should be in hell. I thought, oh my God, this was such a learning opportunity. This was such a teachable moment, when they could have said, no, this is what we mean by, people assuming responsibility for the well-being, the spiritual, intellectual, and cultural well-being, in addition to the physical well-being of a child. It's simply a symbol of that and not anything else. You see what I mean?
It's not complete. I had this experience once, but this was my first Roma mother. And I had made a cradle for her because I wasn't allowed to have a cradle for my own children. Um, and she was pregnant, she had her baby, and then 8 days after, the police came and threw them out in a terrible rainstorm on the day of San Lorenzo. And her husband telephoned me. He said, Hedra is in a bad way with the baby Leonardo. And could you help us? So I went with this huge umbrella under this torrential rainpour. And I said to her, come and stay with me in the cemetery. And she said, I can't. The baby's not baptized. And she believed that for an unbaptized baby to be in a cemetery would be extremely dangerous. illiterate, and so forth. And so we walked past the Duomo, and I thought, shall I take her and the baby in and ask for the priest to baptize the baby? And I said to myself, no, I know he won't do it. And I was right. So I said, Hedera, I will baptize the baby. And I did, and it was lovely. I had a great big bowl, which since has collapsed into pieces. It was from our kitchen, but it was with the words of the Trinity. It was baptism. And it was absolutely lovely because I put the husband and the wife and the newborn baby in the cradle in my cell and went to sleep in the library. And it was, she would sing to the baby the lullaby of Alleluia, which I've recorded in this beautiful deep faith. And then later on, Prior Levy of the San Lorenzo Church was very concerned about this and went to the Curia, and they discussed it, and they said it is a valid baptism, but it's not a legal one, and there'll be no paperwork done, and don't ever do this again. Because the Italians could not accept the idea of a baby being brought into the community. So I have kept my promise, but at the same time, remember in canon law, even a pagan can baptize a Christian, and Virgil does this with Dante on the shores of Purgatory. Baptism is the one sacrament that anyone can do, doesn't need a priest, and it can even be done by someone who is not himself a Christian. That was a very moving experience. I was sad about having to be obedient. But we have in this cemetery, there is a part where they put the unbaptized babies. And I've seen in the archives one case where an Anglican priest, the baby was not yet baptized, had died, and he only entered the burial record in pencil. And I really felt shocked by that.
What's the significance of entering the burial record in pencil?
Because it wasn't considered a Christian. This was an English baby born in Lucca.
Well, so entering it in pencil is what you did if you didn't consider the child a Christian?
Right.
Oh, God.
I know. And Elizabeth and Robert were really upset about this. But the Anglican priest just did not consider that this soul had been saved.
It continues to amaze me how exclusionary institutions are when it comes to something as ostensibly inclusive as a community of faith.
Yes.
You know, it's like people go out of their way to like they go out of their way to find ways to exclude when the spirit of it should be the opposite.
Right.
You know, it's incredible. If I may, this I think opens the possibility then of looking at Tejo's baptism, or João de Sousa's baptism, right? Which is going to be responding to a question that you asked me earlier about him having offspring, right? Because he's a monk and he has offspring. So after they've told their stories and each is given the story, the book of the name of their birth, this is the following paragraph. The tale that João de Sousa told, dancing the shape of river and cross, drawing carracks upon the ground, holding the salvaged compass aloft, also sang the Shepherd King's song of the Shepherd Lord shielding them in the valley of the shadow of death and leading them to refuge and shelter offered by unexpected friends. Surely goodness and mercy, he sang, shall follow me all the days of my life. The villagers watched and listened, and when he had finished his story, They named him for the river Tagus at the heart of the land of the sailors who stopped at the harbor beyond the forest. His new name, Tejo of the Lioness Mountains, humbled João de Sousa, and his grateful heart lifted up and sang the song of David Rey. And I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. It was not many moons before the newly arrived were also working the village crafts, adding the accents of their lands and languages, joining fishing or trading troops, or weaving their hair in the same elaborate styles of their new forest kin. And João de Sousa, too, lived many long reigns anew in that village, as did his children who came to be, and his grandchildren as well, all herding and thatching and fishing and hunting, as their mountain kinsmen had always done. Tejo of the Lioness Mountains was long advanced in years, browned and bent, still thin, with deep-set eyes, and radiant with peace, when one day Anyango Maya returned in his waking dream to tell him that his descendants thrived still in the world of time by the lake at the eye of the great river Nile. And so Tejo of the Lioness Mountains took out the compass he still carried with him, and lifting one side of his lips in a smile, handed it to Anyango Maya. Give this to my kin, he said, my children and their children, and may it always keep them true, away from death and bondage, away from rage and pitiless hunger, and from the bilious blood that putrefies the hearts of all the kings and captains of the land where I was born. So this figure, who was a monk, a very young one when we first met him on the first ship with Vasco da Gama, and a very pious one too, right? A man who knew scripture in his heart. When he's taken prisoner by Vasco da Gama, he essentially resigns himself to that. He doesn't resist, right?
Yeah.
And he tells Vasco da Gama that he's not going to resist. And throughout the journey, he continues to pray. He continues to remain quite devoted to his faith. And then this waking dream salvation miracle that Anyango Maya catalyzes takes him and all the other captives into this mountain village. And so we have this scene of their initiation, inauguration, and bringing in to a new community of kinship, right? And he lives the rest of his life there as Tejo of the Lioness Mountains, right? This is his new name. It is a name that humbles him and for which he's truly grateful, and one that he interprets as the path that the Lord has led him into, right? Because the whole time he's singing this psalm, right? From yes, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil. Thou preparest a table before me, my cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. So once he's baptized and brought into that, he sees this as the path that his faith has led him to. And part of that path means also assimilating completely, right, into this community. So it's really interesting. The question that you ask is really interesting, and I'd love to hear you elaborate on it. But I do remember when I was writing it, and even now, every time I read it, understanding that the vows that one takes, right, as a religious, and in Tejo's case, he's not specified, but I suspect that he's Franciscan, actually. The description of his clothing and everything about him just sounds Franciscan to me. But the vows that he takes also suggest that celibacy might be one of them, right? And yet, then the question arises, so is he violating those vows? Is he in transgression of those vows when he assumes this other identity? And my my intuitive response to that is that I think his response is a sincere and legitimate one, based on his faith and what he believes, his how he believes his faith is leading him.
Yes. Well, I love to, in the way you have the psalm that goes through the book, but it's not just with Tejo. It's like Dante's use of Psalm 113, isn't it? Where he's talked about it in the Convivio, in the letter to Cangrande, he wrote that, and it's there in Purgatorio too. And that is also a psalm of liberation. O bella libertà. And in this case, the psalm is about being protected. The other is also about being protected and saving oneself from the enemy. And yes, in a sense, he has been treated so badly by the institution. What loyalty does he have left to it? In a sense, I mean, he was about to be tried by the Inquisition and burned. And I think Dante's in a very similar situation where if you are exiled, you are also excommunicated. And there he is writing in the state of excommunication and exile the most profound and splendid layman's theology outside of the structure of the church, able from that margin to criticize its shortcomings. And in a sense, what Tejo finds is the kingdom of heaven, this community, which he hasn't found in Portugal and on the seas.
And in his mind, this is the house of the Lord, right? And I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. The idea that,
And it's
exactly
Maya
as you
who
said,
saves him.
yes, and the idea that he has found, it's really interesting though, because there's one passing mention, I think, of his searching for this kingdom of heaven, right? I think it's when one of the chroniclers is
Yes.
talking about him, right? Talking about how they all think he's very delicate, and they're all moved to protect him. And he's repeating the things that he hears Tejo say, right? And one of the psalms that Tejo likes to mention is a psalm that I think is the beginning of the psalm. Well, is it? Well, yeah. So the psalm where he talks about thirsting for the Lord and wanting to be one with the Lord, right? And so I think this is the one of the few moments where we get an explicit expression of what does Tejo want, or Tejo, João de Sousa. What does João de Sousa want, right? João de Sousa is also, from the very beginning, even if we don't think about it in liturgical or biblical terms, João de Sousa is drawn very strongly to kinship, right? He seeks it out, and he holds on to it, and he does not discriminate whence that kinship comes from, because he even thinks in his mind, first with the St. Thomas Christians in Mombasa, and then later with the new converts who Vasco da Gama is about to murder. He says, but these men are the vessels of the Lord, right? They house the Spirit of God in them. because he has that sense of indiscriminate fraternity and kinship and brotherhood for all of humanity around him, right? And so this thirst for kinship that for him overlaps with the thirst for the Lord means that Tejo sees God in everything, in
Yes.
everyone, right? And in essence, for a man like this, the let me see, the details, the specifics of rituals and ceremonies are contingent, right? For lack of a better word. And that includes the details and specifics of a vow to celibacy, because it's not the celibacy itself that is the expression of faith, right? It's an instrument of expression, certainly. But when the very Lord actually, shows a different path and opens new possibilities, right? Then surely it is the fool who refuses to consider that path.
Yes.
You know, I was fascinated. I discovered something. Again, one of those things where you discover after the fact. And honestly, Julia, I don't know how much of this is my subconscious digging things up, right? And how much of it is my cleverness at action, right?
Yes.
I can't tell. So I'll be honest about that and just say that Psalm, I believe it's Psalm 7. It's very early on, right? The seventh line of Psalm 7. I'm going to read the translation from the. Sorry. I think this English translation may be wrong. Sorry. That my English translation is completely wrong. So I have to find the correct translation. What is happening here?
I
Excuse
don't
me.
have the Bible here to look.
Yeah, I happen to
Right.
have one here, and this is so weird. So Psalm 7 in Latin gives me what I need, but in English translation, it's not what I need. This is so weird. The
What is
Psalm
the
was
Latin?
The Latin is it starts out with no one is the seventh verse is exurge Domine in ira tua et exaltare infinibus in incorum meorum et exurge Domine Deus meus in precepto quod mandasti, etc., right? And then
One, go out, rise up. Um,
I'm pretty sure this is the right song I'm looking at. Let me just see if I can find it again. Oh, so this is why I should prepare better in the beginning.
well, if we can't
Yeah,
figure
the Utica Kausam Tuam. That's what I'm looking for. Maybe I have the wrong psalm actually. Let me just make sure that I have the right psalm. So I'm looking for the one that is also the standard of the uh, Psalm 73, I believe it was. Oh, how could I get that wrong? Let me see if it is in fact Psalm 73. Let me just check, okay? Oh, this is quite terrible.
no.
This is what
Let's
happened
go
to
back
me.
to Tejo and
Please go on.
what
Go,
went
go on
wrong with.
while I look for this passage.
Okay.
Please go on.
What went wrong from Tejo to Anatole?
I'm sorry. Say that again.
Okay, Anatole is descended from Tejo,
Yes.
and Tejo is essentially good.
Yes.
Anatole has this problem,
Hmm.
and I'm wondering what went wrong.
Oh, what a wonderful question. What went wrong? Oh, Julia, is it possible to identify what went wrong? What's really interesting is that the wax, as it were, right? If we take the Aristotelian Dantean idea of the
Yes.
wax, right? The wax is good, right? The wax is fine. It's the mold into
Yes.
which the wax is poured
So
that then
something was wrong with the mold.
that expresses itself, right? And Tejo, the essential linking sort of characteristic, the genetic trait that goes all the way from Tejo, from João de Sousa / Tejo, right, all
Yes.
the way down to Anatole, is this. We see it expressed in the young Nato's predisposition to clairvoyant dreams, right? So this is something that he's inherited. In his story, we also understand how the name Tejo itself is inherited from father to daughter to grandson, from father to daughter to grandson. So it doesn't discriminate between who, who's going to pass it down to the next person. So it's not just patrilineal, matrilineal. It weaves through, right?
Yes.
For me, this was interesting at that moment of writing. Excuse the little excursus, the little parentheses. It was interesting at the moment of writing because I actually did a little bit of read up on genetic inheritance, and I wondered whether it would make a difference if this was a trait that was restricted to either matrilineal or patrilineal legacy. And so I looked into sort of traits that don't discriminate, right? And that it made the most sense to me because I was seeing the problem with having only one or the other, matrilineal and patrilineal, meant that it's a trait that could die out quite quickly, right? But if it was indiscriminate, then it could even skip generations, several generations even, and then show up again somewhere else. So that was one thing. So you have the naming, you have the genetic trait, right, that they share. And you also have, and this is something that Hera clearly shares, you have actually two things that Hera clearly shares. One is the the world around them, the people are naturally drawn to them.
Yes.
Like people love them intuitively, right?
Yes. But
In
she is more like Tejo than Anatole.
yes, and yet Anatole is also sort of loved intuitively. Do you know what I mean? So all
Right.
three of them share that particular trait. And then the other trait that all of them share, although it manifests differently, is their bibliophilia, right? I remember you were so tickled by Hera showing up in London with just luggage full of
Yeah,
books,
I know.
right?
Right.
And
Yes.
we have this bibliophilia manifest in her father when he's young, right? He's a voracious reader, right?
Yes. Yes.
And Teja's bibliophilia is focused on the Bible. He knows it by heart through and through, right? So this text is what leads him. And
Yes.
so the question being, what went wrong? It makes me think. I love the question because it had never occurred to me, but it does make me think about Canto 8 of Paradiso, right? When Dante is talking about heredity, right? He's in the sphere of Venus, which is about sort of souls who were overly enthusiastic in their amorous amorous inclinations. Exactly. And he does this beautiful thing where in the past where we've seen souls inclined to venereal love. I'm sorry that's such a sad word, but let me put it that way. Like the carnal love, let me put it that way. Okay, that's much that's much kinder sounding. So souls are inclined to carnal love in excess. In Inferno, we meet them in the second circle, which is lust, right? In Purgatorio, we meet them in the final terrace, which is also
Yes.
the purgation of lust. And there's more details about like the nature, there's both like heterosexual, homosexual, there's even mentions of the wrongness of bestiality and like all kinds of things like that, right? And then in Paradiso, the sphere of Venus presents us with those people who are overzealous in their carnal pursuits. And yet the discussion is not about the wrongness of the carnal pursuit per se, or the sin of it. The discussion focuses on the reproductive function
Yes.
of carnality, right?
Right.
By looking at genetic legacy, right?
Yeah.
And how, there is fruit that will form that is quite distinct from the tree that shapes it, right? And also that and I think that one of the things that one of my favorite passages, again, here we go again with my favorite passages, right? is when he closes Canto 8 by when he's talking about this heredity, right? Like a man might be truly noble, but then have sons, one who is noble and one who is not, right? And that is perfectly a natural thing. It's not unheard of. And yet, humanity itself makes the biggest mistake when it doesn't pay attention to a soul's natural inclination and then cultivate it in its sort of native inclination, so that human beings or human culture is as likely to force one who's born for the cloth to wield a sword, and one who's born for the battlefield to don the cloth, right? And this is where it distorts nature, where the human habits distort nature. I bring all of this up because when you ask the question, what went wrong? I think we can find some seed of like how to approach the question in that final observation, in that final meditation in Canto 8, because Tejo, when he was growing up, he had all these natural tendencies and inclinations, right? The clairvoyance seems to have been sort of leached out of him, because we don't hear much account of it after he starts his education in the French missionary school. His attractiveness to people, the people's intuition to be drawn to him, we witness it when he's a young child, in the way even when he's in trouble, people still look at him with kind eyes, right, and amusement
Yes.
when he
He knew
shows
how
up.
to manipulate.
But
Right.
no, there's this like sort of nonchalance and insouciance about
Yes.
him, because he just shows up and he's ready to face up to whatever it is that he's being called up to. But everyone, well, they receive him with so much joy and like love that pretty soon they forget that they were supposed to be mad at him, right? And then we see it in his adulthood. He still maintains that, because Marie, the moment she hears his voice, in fact, she hears his voice in a context where everybody around him is enchanted, right? Everybody's enthralled by the sound of his voice, by the way he sounds, and Marie more than all of them put together. And then, as a grown man, family man, we see him in Paris, where all of his neighbors in the 6th arrondissement, they all show up and treat him like an oracle. So with all of these things, what went wrong? Like, what is it about Tejo that is so off? The thing is, one can never say that Tejo is a bad man,
Yeah.
right? He's negligent, and he
Right.
is, and he, how would I say it?
Well, he is a bit narcissistic, and
Opportunistic
there's an
even.
attractiveness to that.
Yeah, and opportunistic in that he takes what comes to him
Right. Not
without
not not being, sort of very much aware of the consequences.
not aware of the consequences or the cost to others. So he
Yeah.
never considers the cost of what is coming to him, right?
Hmm.
He accepts it happily. And then beyond that, doesn't think about it.
Hmm.
Beyond that, does not engage
Hmm.
with what it signifies. And the fact that he does that twice with Anna, I think, is a more damning thing. Had it just happened once, that would be one thing. But
Hmm.
that it happens twice, and on both instances, he stays silent, right?
Hmm.
um, with the and then and continues to partake of all of the advantages of his life, his wife's adoration, his children's adoration, his community's adoration, without ever the sting of conscience stopping him. Oh, I'm sorry. Did my am I don't know if you can still hear me. I seem to have frozen. Can you still hear me? Julia?
I can hear you, but you're frozen. Your image is frozen.
Okay, so I think we're fine then. I'll still continue talking, although I think I look weird. So
Okay.
let's try that again.
Now you're coming back, I hope.
Okay, so I believe so. Can you still hear me?
I can hear you,
Okay,
but
good.
just
I'll continue talking then. So
okay.
I think that in his in the to respond to the question,
Hmm.
what went wrong? Um, it is very, very possible to consider, that meditation Dante has about how the world forces a soul into an unnatural mold, right?
Hmm.
Where the wax may be good, but if the mold is bad, then the result is going to be in some way corrupted. And I
Hmm.
think that Tejo, who is essentially made of good wax, like Anatole, who's essentially made of good wax, and who in turn produces good wax, right? If I'm beating this metaphor to death, but he produces good wax. He's nevertheless poured into a corrupting mold, I think,
Hmm.
um, when he is when he is
But it's a bit of a mutation from Tejo, isn't it?
mhm. Tell me what you mean by that. And I'm hoping that my picture
Um,
comes back
that
soon.
it's not the copy of Tejo. That there's a change,
Yes,
the
yes,
genetic
absolutely.
makeup. Hmm.
Hmm. Can you imagine a counterfactual where like, oh, let me put it differently. What are the how would you distinguish Tejo of the Lioness Mountains ethically from Anatole Basile?
Well, but we don't really have enough details. But we do
Hmm.
know he fathers a family,
Hmm.
and it seems as though he would have been responsible
Hmm.
in doing so. Um, One hopes he's not going to be like a sect leader, etc., which could have been possible with Anatole.
Hmm. Hmm. Yes, yes. And Tejo isn't, because we
Yeah.
meet Tejo when he's very old,
Hmm.
right? Ostensibly at the end of his life. And even we meet him after his life. And
Hmm.
João de Sousa disappeared after Calecut, right?
Yes.
Because once João de Sousa went into Vasco da Gama's boat in chains, there is no subsequent account of him, right? He's, in Sierra Leone, he escapes, and one can imagine that after that point on, there's no longer any more account of him. So
Hmm.
so any legends about João de Sousa, because there are legends about him, right, from Calicut and from
What
Mombasa.
are the legends?
So the legends about João de Sousa are that in Mombasa he was able to speak tongues when he could communicate with the Indian Christians,
Right.
right?
Hmm.
So that was the first miracle, that he could communicate with them, because
Yes.
he
Hmm.
joined them in singing the Paternoster, but in their language,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And there are all kinds of hypotheses about why he could do that. And
Hmm.
then the other legend is after Calicut, when he pronounced this psalm, or the words of this psalm. I believe it's Psalm 73. I should have been more responsible about this, but these words of this psalm that were used as the device of the Inquisition itself, right? So the Inquisition, in their banners, they have that quotation, "Exurge Domine, Judicam causam tuam," right? And that they're claiming the psalm as they're claiming themselves as the warriors of the faith, in God's name. But when João de Sousa says those words, he is calling upon God to avenge these outraged souls, these souls that Vasco da Gama is outraging. And it's that phrase that is appropriated by the Inquisition is what carries the legend of the miracle that João de Sousa performed by when he converted the 3 who were going to be killed by Vasco da Gama, and he converted them to Christianity, and then said this prayer. Vasco da Gama tried to have them shot with arrows, but the arrows wouldn't touch their skin. The arrows wouldn't pierce the skin. And everyone recognized that as a miracle. And that made Vasco da Gama afraid to prosecute João de Sousa when he realized that João de Sousa was speaking against his violence, right? And so the miracles, and the way miracles, the way legend grows is that it goes from one person's lips to another person's ears, and it goes across waters and oceans and is carried by the wind. And pretty soon, even the nuns in Mombasa from Kerala, when they met when they met Mama Koth, they were telling her about the miracles of João de Sousa. So it's no longer about a specific miracle, but more like the idea that this was a miracle worker, right? And so despite all of that existing, when he becomes Tejo of the Lioness Mountains, that history is no longer attached to this individual. And like you said, he never becomes a sect leader or a cult leader or whatever. He just assimilates into the culture.
Now, is this part fiction or fact? Does it have
which
its
part?
bearing in legends, or is it made up?
Wait, which part? The part of him becoming
Tejo.
Oh no, this is all part of the poetry.
And it is extant poetry.
No, this is part of the poetry of rain. This is part of the story of rain.
Okay, it's only in rain.
It's only in rain, exactly.
Okay,
plain answer, it's fiction. It's fiction. There you go. Yes. Yes. I intermix the words fiction and poetry in my mind, so this is why I sounded a little bit unclear. But yes, it's the fiction of the story, and I think it's worth exploring what it means. No, I think it's worth considering, because I don't know if there's any one thing I could say about why it's that way. I don't know if there's any one thing I could say about. I wish the picture would come back. Like, I wish the image would come back.
I know. And actually, since I was up until midnight last
night, I turned on Wi-Fi.
I think we probably should draw this to an end.
Yes. Let me try just out of courtesy to see if I can bring the image back, because I feel so terrible that I'm sort of blacked out, almost behind a veil, as it were, and speaking to you. But it's good that we can still hear each other. This is fine. So, but you're right that I think we should bring it to a draw, because I know that you need to go to sleep, my dear, and here. And I was so glad that Simona joined us in the chat and had all these questions and suggestions for us. Oh, look, it looks like it's coming back, sort of, I think. Oh, is it coming back? I hope so. Simona had all these questions.
Right now, it's all gone. Were there any questions that came in? Or has it completely stopped? I think now I'm not hearing anything.
Oh.
Now I think you're going to begin to come back.
Okay, you're still there. Now you're blacked out too. But can you hear me?
I can hear
Julia,
you. Yes.
Can you still hear me? Okay, I can hear you and I can see you. But you're absolutely right. It's time for us to leave. So let me just say good night and thank you. And
good night, and thank you.
yes, yes, and thank you. You know, I'm going to be listening to this one again because I think earlier on you were talking. Well, I'll know better when I actually see it. But let's continue the conversation. I think next week we have book 8, Snow, right? Which
Yes.
is a book in which Alex comes back in a very robust way. And I had a reflection about it, and whose details I've forgotten, but I hope I will have brought them. I will have recalled them again tomorrow, next week. And let me see. Is there any preview that I can give to book 8? This is where the children travel abroad, and we get a little bit of a glimpse, not much detail, but a glimpse into their life in boarding school,
Mm-hmm.
um, and not an institutional glimpse per se, rather just their close interaction and the distinction between they're growing up in a boarding school where there are caretakers around them, and then they're being transplanted abroad to a place where there are none, right? And they essentially have to fend for themselves, even in fairly extreme circumstances. And Esther is left to look after them without
Right.
the confidence of being able to do so well. So, oh, one last thing. In book 8, Snow, we also get the paralleled dream walk with Olóo's dream walk in book 2, where he experienced snow for the first time. Okay.
Yes.
So I look forward to it, my dear. And you look very tired. So let me say good night. You can't see me blowing kisses at you, but that's what I'm doing. And
Yes.
sleep well. And I'll read the essay
You
and
too.
we'll talk about it.
Yes.
I'll read your essay and we can talk about it. Okay, dear?
Thank you. Right.
Okay. Good night, my dear.
Good night. God bless.
Okay. You too, my dear. God bless you. And with that, we come to the end of today's broadcast, which was quite a bit of fun, even with the image blacked out. Thank you all for joining. Good night.